September 1356. They expected screaming, blood, and chains. Instead, the first sound many remembered was the scrape of a quill on parchment. A noblewoman is pulled from a manor at dawn, the smoke from nearby villages still hanging low over the fields. The fighting is already finished by the time she is found. Men shout orders, but not at her. A rider dismounts, not roughly, not gently either, and asks her name, her father's name, her husband's name. Each answer is repeated aloud so a clerk can write it down. Jewelry is removed piece by piece, counted, wrapped in cloth. Not stolen. Logged. That moment alone tells her something is wrong. Or different. Across western France during the middle years of the 100 Years' War, capture did not always mean ruin. At places like Poitiers, and along the roads feeding toward Tours and Chinon, noble households were swept up as armies moved fast and loose through the countryside. Knights expected ransom. Lords expected negotiation, and noblewomen, though rarely fighters, were part of that same economy of value. She is not bound. She is not struck. A mounted escort forms around her as if she were being delivered, not taken. One soldier mutters that the road ahead is unsafe. Another adjusts his cloak and asks whether she can ride. She can. The castle comes into view by late afternoon. Stone walls, banners unfamiliar to her, a gate that opens without urgency. No cheering, no insults, just procedure. Inside the gate, her shoes leave marks in the mud of a courtyard where servants still move about their tasks. Life has not stopped here. A steward meets her before the lord of the castle does. He bows, shallow but proper, and explains where she will stay. He does not call her a prisoner. He does not call her free. "You are under our protection," he says, and pauses just long enough for the second meaning to land. Protection from the war outside. Protection from escape. She is led upward, not down. Past storage rooms, past kitchens that smell of bread and boiled vegetables. The chamber assigned to her has a shuttered window, a chest, and a straw mattress already laid out. There is a blanket, coarse but clean. A basin for washing. A woman waits inside, older, quiet, eyes alert. Not a servant, not quite a guard. That night, she eats with the household. Not at the high table, but close enough to hear it. Bread, stew, ale watered down. She is given the same portion as the women who serve the lady of the house. No one rushes her. No one watches her chew. Later, when the door closes, it locks from the outside. This is the first truth of noble captivity. Violence is not required when control is complete. For women of rank, especially those tied to powerful families, captivity was a managed state. Killing them brought no profit. Harming them invited revenge. Keeping them alive, well-fed, and visible was not mercy. It was strategy. Records from the period show careful accounting. Food allowances, clothing, expenses, even payments for candles used in private chambers. Everything could be reclaimed later, folded into ransom demands or marriage negotiations. The woman lying awake on the straw mattress does not know how long she will remain. Days feel possible. Weeks feel dangerous. Years are unthinkable. Outside, the countryside is being stripped bare by soldiers who will never see the inside of this room. Inside, the rules are already forming around her. She will need permission to attend chapel. She will need permission to walk the walls. She will need permission to write. She will be spoken to politely, always by people who can refuse her. In later letters, some women would say this moment was the worst. Not the capture itself, but the realization that nothing openly cruel needed to happen for her life to be fully taken out of her hands. That she would eat well, sleep safely, and still belong to someone else's plan. The gate has closed behind her, but the war has not ended. It has simply changed shape. But safety, once accepted, becomes its own kind of trap, and the days ahead will teach her how carefully this calm has been built. The morning bell rings early, not for her, but for the castle. She wakes to movement beyond the door, footsteps, a murmured exchange, the sound of keys. When the door opens, it is not a guard who enters, but the same older woman who waited in the chamber the night before. She carries clean linen and a small loaf of bread. No greeting is offered. None is required. This is how days begin inside the women's quarters, quietly, predictably, with the steady message that someone else decides the rhythm. The space she now inhabits sits high within the inner walls, far from the gate and far from any dungeon. These quarters are not luxurious, but they are orderly. Several rooms open onto a narrow passage where light filters in through slit windows. Other women live here too. Some are members of the household. Others arrived as she did, carried in by war. They are separated not by bars, but by rank. A captured noblewoman is expected to behave as one. She dresses herself if she can. She keeps her hair covered. She eats when the household eats. In return, she is spared the rough labor demanded of lower status captives. No hauling water, no scrubbing floors. Her work, if it can be called that, is to remain presentable and compliant. She learns the rules quickly because they are enforced without shouting. She may sit by the window during daylight hours, but only when another woman is in the room. She may walk the passage after the noon meal. She may attend chapel twice a week, escorted, always escorted. The guards wait outside. Inside, the women watch one another. Conversation fills the long hours. It stays shallow at first. Weather, cloth. News that arrives late and stripped of detail. Slowly, fragments slip through. One woman speaks of a husband captured 2 winters ago and never returned. Another admits she no longer knows which side controls her family lands. A third says nothing at all and sews until her fingers ache. The strangest part is the absence of cruelty. No one raises a hand. No one threatens harm. When disagreements arise, they are smoothed over by reminders of patience and prayer. The lady of the house visits once a week, sometimes twice. She asks after health. She inspects clothing. She gives instructions that sound kind until one listens closely. "You must remain ready," she says, and everyone understands what that means. Ready to be exchanged, ready to be married, ready to be sent home or sent away. Meals arrive on trays carried by servants who do not look at them. Bread, vegetables, sometimes fish. Meat appears on feast days. The portions are fair. No one leaves hungry. This is not generosity. It is maintenance. A noblewoman who grows thin loses value. One who falls ill becomes a burden. At night, the door locks again. The woman learns to measure time by small things. How often candles are replaced. How quickly news spreads. How long it takes for footsteps to fade after sunset. She learns that comfort can exist without choice, that safety can be offered without consent. Letters are discussed in whispers. Who has been allowed to write? Who has been refused? One woman says her last message was dictated word by word while a clerk listened. Another says she was told to wait until terms were clearer. Silence becomes its own punishment. Days blur together, but memory sharpens. Every detail feels important. The sound of the chapel bell, the smell of clean wool, the way the door clicks before dawn. These things settle deep because they are all she is permitted to keep. Some women later said this was the moment they understood the danger, not because they were afraid of being hurt, but because they were afraid of becoming used to it. of accepting this narrow life as reasonable, of mistaking order for care. The war outside continues, unseen but never absent. Smoke sometimes rises beyond the walls. Refugees pass through the gate and leave again. Inside, the women sew, pray, eat, and wait. And waiting, done long enough, reshapes a person. But comfort has limits, and soon she will learn that every kindness here comes with a price already written down. The first time she asks for something small, she understands how this place truly works. It is nothing dramatic. A request for thicker stockings as winter presses in. The stone rooms grow colder each night, and the straw mattress does little to hold warmth. The older woman listens without comment and leaves. Hours pass. Then a steward arrives with the answer. "Yes," he says, "but it will be recorded." The stockings come the next day. Wool, serviceable, not fine. A clerk notes the cost on a narrow strip of parchment. Ink dries. The matter is settled. Comfort, granted. Debt, created. This is how captivity maintains its balance. Nothing is free, even when it looks generous. Food, fuel, clothing, candles, medicine. All of it is tracked. The woman begins to understand that her body is being preserved and like property set aside for future exchange. Movement follows the same logic. She is allowed to walk the inner wall after midday prayers, but only when the weather is clear, and only in the company of the older woman or another household lady. The view is wide. Fields stretch out beyond the castle, some green, some scarred by recent fighting. Seeing them brings a tightness she does not voice. The guards never rush her, never threaten her. They simply wait at every turning point, present enough to make refusal unnecessary. When she pauses too long at the wall, one clears his throat. When she lingers in the chapel after the others leave, a hand rests on the door. Kindness here is efficient. Other women speak openly now. They trade information the way merchants trade goods. Who is likely to be ransomed quickly? Who has powerful brothers? Who has already been promised to someone new? One woman admits she has been told her stay will end with a marriage arranged by her captor, meant to bind lands and loyalties together. Her voice is calm when she says it. That frightens the others more than anger would have. Meals remain steady. Bread improves when supply lines hold. It worsens when they fail. Feast days still bring meat and spiced wine. On those nights, laughter rises more easily, and guilt follows close behind. Outside the walls, villages go hungry. Inside, the captives are fed well enough to last. The lady of the house continues her visits. She brings small gifts now. A ribbon, a book of prayers, a better cloak. Each offering is paired with a reminder spoken softly. "We take care of our guests," she says. Guest. The word is never corrected. It does not need to be. Letters finally come. The first is written slowly, every line weighed. The clerk sits across the table as the woman speaks. Her words are turned into careful phrases that promise obedience, patience, and hope for negotiation. Nothing emotional survives the process intact. When the letter is sealed, it does not feel like it belongs to her anymore. Weeks pass without reply. During this time, the rules tighten without announcement. Chapel visits are reduced. Walks along the wall become shorter. One woman is moved to a different chamber and does not return. No explanation is given. Silence spreads quickly through the quarters. The realization settles in. Comfort is conditional, and conditions can change without warning. She begins to watch herself, her posture, her tone, her expressions. A careless remark might delay a letter. A display of frustration might cost a privilege. Survival now includes appearing grateful. Some nights, she lies awake counting the things she is allowed to have. A bed, warm food, light, protection from violence, and then she counts what she is denied. Choice, privacy, time, a future she controls. The balance is deliberate, enough given to prevent rebellion, enough withheld to ensure dependence. Those who later called this life almost peaceful were not lying. But peace built on permission is fragile. It can be withdrawn as easily as it is granted. She senses this now, in the careful smiles, in the quiet ledgers, in the way everyone speaks as if her fate is already decided, just not yet revealed. But the longer the comfort lasts, the heavier the waiting becomes, and soon waiting itself will be the greatest pressure of all. Time stretches differently behind stone walls. Days are still marked by bells and meals, but weeks lose their edges. Without dates to anchor them, everything begins to blur. The women start to remember events by seasons instead. The cold phase, the muddy phase, the return of birds to the inner yard. Each change signals survival, not progress. She waits for news. Every sound of boots in the corridor sharpens her attention. Every letter carried past her door feels personal, even when it is not meant for her. When the older woman enters with empty hands, disappointment settles quietly and stays. Ransom talks rarely move in straight lines. A messenger rides out. Another returns with partial answers. Conditions are discussed, revised, argued over by men who will never see the inside of this chamber. Lands are disputed. Debts are questioned. Alliances shift. While armies clash and treaties fail, the women remain exactly where they are. Letters finally arrive, but they change little. Her family writes carefully, weighed down by caution and hope. They speak of efforts being made, of talks underway, of trust in God, and patience. No timelines are offered, no promises made. Between the lines, she hears what is not said. Resources are strained. Priorities compete. War drains everything. Some women receive nothing at all. One confesses in a whisper that her last reply came more than a year ago. Another admits she has stopped asking. The silence hurts less, she says, when it becomes expected. That admission lingers in the room long after she finishes speaking. The strain does not come from hunger or fear of attack. It comes from uncertainty that never resolves. Every morning begins the same, and every night ends with the same locked door. There is no climax, no release, only the steady pressure of not knowing when or how this will end. The castle staff grows familiar. Guards change. Stewards age. Children appear where none existed before. Life inside the walls continues, indifferent to the captives waiting. That realization cuts deep. The world does not pause for them. Rumors move faster than truth. A treaty is signed. A battle is lost. A lord is taken prisoner. Each piece of news brings a flicker of hope, quickly followed by fear. A change in power can help or destroy them. No one knows which. The women begin to imagine futures they do not want, simply because imagining something is better than imagining nothing. Marriage to a stranger. Years more of confinement. Being traded for land they will never see again. Some even picture remaining here forever, slowly absorbed into the household as permanent dependents. That thought frightens her more than violence ever did. She notices changes in herself, how quickly she accepts new limits, how easily she adapts to reduced expectations, how relief comes from small permissions granted. A longer chapel visit, an extra candle at night. The system works because it trains patience into obedience. At times, she feels guilty for her relative comfort. News from outside speaks of burned homes, and broken families. Compared to that, her life feels sheltered. That guilt keeps her quiet. It keeps many of them quiet. Yet the waiting never loosens its grip. It presses into sleep, into prayer, into conversation. Even laughter feels risky, as if enjoying anything might tempt fate. Those who survived this kind of captivity often said later that the waiting changed them more than the capture itself. It taught them how power could be exercised without force, how control could be maintained through delay rather than pain. She senses now that her fate may be decided far away by people who do not think of her as a person, but as a solution to a problem. And she understands how small she has become in that calculation. But waiting cannot last forever, and when it finally breaks, it rarely breaks gently. The change does not arrive with shouting or steel. It comes quietly, delivered in fragments. A steward stops explaining decisions. The lady of the house shortens her visits. Guards linger longer outside doors. One morning, chapel is closed without warning. No reason is given. No apology offered. The rules have shifted, and everyone feels it at once. War has turned again. Somewhere beyond the walls, a treaty has failed, or a lord has fallen. Power has moved, and this castle has adjusted accordingly. The women do not need to be told. They recognize the signs the way sailors read the sky. One of them is taken away before dawn. She leaves behind a folded cloak and a half-finished piece of sewing. By midday, her bed has been stripped. The older woman avoids questions. The steward says only that arrangements have been made. No one is told where she has gone or why. The uncertainty spreads faster than fear. That is when safety reveals its second edge. Up until now, kindness followed clear logic. Preserve value. Avoid retaliation. Maintain order. But when circumstances change, value is redefined. A woman once worth keeping intact can suddenly become useful in other ways. Marriage is mentioned aloud for the first time, not as a future possibility, but as a solution. A union that would settle claims, bind families, end disputes. Consent is discussed politely, as if it were a detail rather than a choice. The woman listening understands immediately that refusal is theoretical. Another woman is told her ransom will not be paid. Her family's lands have been seized. Their influence has faded. She is no longer leverage. She will remain here, supported but contained, indefinitely. The sentence is delivered with sympathy. That makes it worse. Daily routines continue, but tension presses into every exchange. Meals are quieter. Conversations shorten. Everyone weighs each word. The sense of calm that once felt stable now feels thin, easily torn. She begins to notice how quickly comfort can vanish. Walks along the wall are cancelled. Letters are delayed again. One night, guards enter the women's quarters to search chests. Nothing is taken, but the message is clear. Control can become visible at any time. The greatest danger is not physical harm. It is erasure. To be married off without choice. To be held forever because releasing her no longer benefits anyone. To be passed between households as part of agreements she will never hear spoken aloud. The women talk late into the night, voices low, plans cautious. Some speak of escape, but the walls are high and the roads are watched. Others speak of faith. Others say nothing at all. Each weighs the risks differently. She realizes then that what frightened her most during capture was not the enemy. It was uncertainty. And now uncertainty has returned, sharpened by familiarity. She knows exactly what she stands to lose. The older woman, who has said little since the beginning, finally speaks. She has seen this before. She tells them that comfort was never a promise. It was a pause a pause that lasts only as long as it serves those in power. That truth settles heavily. When news finally arrives, it is delivered with ceremony. Terms have been agreed upon. She will leave the castle within the week. Relief floods her first, then suspicion. At what cost? To whom? Under what conditions? Others are not so fortunate. One will stay. Another will be sent elsewhere. No explanations are given beyond what is necessary to enforce obedience. Safety has not turned into violence. It has turned into finality. The system that once preserved them now sorts them, efficiently and without sentiment. The realization is brutal. Being treated well never meant being safe. It meant being useful. And usefulness can end. But endings rarely bring peace, and what waits beyond these walls will test whether survival inside them was truly a gift. She leaves the castle at first light. The gate opens without ceremony. No crowd gathers. No speech is given. A small escort waits, mounted and silent, prepared to deliver her to the next stage of an agreement made elsewhere. As she crosses the threshold, she looks back once, not out of gratitude, but out of habit. The walls that held her are unchanged. They will hold others. Her destination is named only at the last moment. South, toward the Loire, toward the fortress at Loches, where exchanges are handled carefully, witnessed properly, and recorded in ink that lasts longer than memory. The road is cold, the pace steady. No one speaks unless necessary. Freedom, she learns quickly, is not the same as release. At Loches, she is received with courtesy and inspected like a document. Her health is noted, her clothing assessed. A representative from her family arrives days later, thinner than she remembers, older around the eyes. They embrace once, stiffly. Words fail them, too much has changed. Terms are finalized. Land will shift hands. Debts will be forgiven. Promises will be made that may or may not be kept. When she is told she may go home, the relief is sharp but incomplete. Home is no longer what it was, neither is she. Others do not leave with her. One woman remains behind, destined for a marriage she did not choose. Another is transferred north, where her name carries weight, but her family does not. Their paths diverge quietly, without protest. This is how these stories often end, not with justice, with arrangement. Years later, some of these women will speak of their captivity in careful terms. They will say they were treated well, that they were fed, clothed, and protected. Compared to the burned villages and broken bodies outside the walls, it will sound almost generous. They will not be lying, but they will leave out what that comfort required. Silence, compliance, gratitude for permission. They will leave out how easily a person can adapt to limits when survival depends on it, how the absence of cruelty can still strip away choice, slowly and completely. The castles that held them were not anomalies. They were part of a system that understood power deeply, a system that knew violence was loud, but control could be quiet, that knew preserving life could serve domination just as well as destroying it. For many noblewomen, captivity became a lesson learned too early and remembered too well. That safety offered by those who hold power is never neutral. That kindness tied to leverage is still a chain. That being spared harm does not mean being spared loss. Some returned home and lived long lives, carrying this knowledge with them. Others were absorbed into new households, their stories folded into different names. A few vanished from records entirely, remembered only as clauses in treaties or margins in account books. What binds them is not suffering alone, but clarity. They saw, from inside stone walls, how order can disguise coercion, how comfort can soften resistance, how easily people accept limits when those limits arrive wrapped in routine. Their stories matter because they feel familiar, because the structures that held them did not vanish with the Middle Ages. They changed shape. They learned new language. But the lesson remains the same. When power offers protection, it always expects something in return. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to question where comfort ends and control begins in the world around you. History does not repeat itself cleanly, but it teaches clearly to those willing to listen. If you want more stories like this, grounded, human, and honest, support the work by liking, subscribing, and sharing. These stories survive only if they are told.